If these old chronicles reach you in the quiet hours, leave word in the comments of the city you listen from, so the record knows how far the echo carried. And if you would keep walking these ruins with me, subscribe to the chronicles and stay near the firelight of memory. Some histories are not learned, they are survived. Netheril did not begin as an empire of floating cities and impossible spells. It began as people with numb hands and wind-burned faces on the hard northern edge of Faerun. Fishers, hunters, farmers, building lives where winter could kill faster than any blade. In those first generations, survival was the only creed. Then elven hands offered human minds a dangerous kindness, instruction in the art. Not a weapon at first, a tool, a lamp in a long dusk. Magic entered the north quietly, a ward against cold, a charm to keep wolves from the pens, a spell to mend a roof beam before the snow came. But even small spells rewrite a culture, because they rewrite what people expect from tomorrow. A child who could shape a cantrip was suddenly more valuable than a child who could swing an axe, and a household that could afford a tutor began to look down on one that could not. The art became education, then profession, then status, and status has a hunger of its own. Here is the first uncomfortable reveal. Netheril's rise was not powered by cruelty alone or brilliance alone. It was powered by certainty, the belief that a problem solved by spellwork was no longer a problem worth respecting. When a civilization learns that the world can be corrected with words, it starts treating the world like a draft that exists to be edited. The hinge in the story came when Netheril's arcanists found lore that was not meant for them to hold. The Nether Scrolls were not merely ancient writings. They were a change in altitude, knowledge that took a people already climbing and gave them a ladder meant for greater beings. After that discovery, Netheril's ambition stopped being a private vice and became a public virtue. The question was no longer, can this be done? The question became, who will do it first, and who will be left behind? Around the middle of Netheril's early ascent, something subtle hardened into law. Arcanists began to replace kings without ever needing a crown. They gathered influence the way storms gather mass. They wrote new rules for wealth and inheritance, with spellcraft as the measure of blood. And because their work produced real miracles, crops protected from blight, roads made safer, wounds closed by prayer-shaped formula, people forgave the arrogance that came with it. The ground folk cheered the skyward gaze, because the skyward gaze brought comfort. But comfort can be a chain. The more Netheril relied on magic, the more its society became layered like enchanted glass, beautiful, precise, and brittle if struck in the right place. Every problem solved by the art made the art more central. Every success made restraint feel like superstition. Netheril did not announce rebellion against the gods. It did something more dangerous. It began to behave as if divine limits were simply outdated customs. And that is the truth that settles like ash over this first chapter. The fall of Netheril did not begin with a single forbidden spell. It began when an empire decided that magic was not a gift to be born carefully, but a right to be taken, until even the laws that made magic possible were treated as obstacles and not as warnings. The art did not merely elevate Netheril, it separated it. Once arcanists became the true measure of status, every other kind of excellence started to look like a relic. The strongest soldier could be replaced by a single well-placed spell. The wisest merchant could be undone by an illusion. The most patient farmer could be surpassed by a mage who knew how to deny frost its season. In time, the Netherese learned a quiet cruelty. They stopped seeing non-wizards as the foundation of a realm and began seeing them as weight, necessary, but only because even a floating dream still needed someone to quarry stone, haul grain, and bury the dead. This is where Netheril's politics becomes hard to recognize as politics at all. It was not ballots or bloodlines. It was spellcraft. Power gathered into enclaves of learning, schools, cabals, circles, until the men and women who controlled high magic also controlled law, wealth, and inheritance. The mage lords did not always rule with open brutality. They did not need to. A society built on magic obeys magic the way lungs obey air. And so Netheril grew in two directions at once. It expanded across the north with settlements, outposts, roads, and it expanded upward into a different kind of life, one that slowly stopped sharing the same reality as the people below. The Great Leap came with what later ages would call the flying enclaves, cities raised from the earth by tremendous workings of the art. That image is so famous that it has become almost decorative in the telling. Shining towers in a blue sky, drifting like slow-moving gods. But the truth beneath the beauty is sharper. A floating city is not only an engineering triumph, it is a declaration. It says, "We do not belong to the ground you live on." That separation changed everything. Down below, farmers still watched weather, still feared drought, still measured life in harvests and graves. Up above, the mage lords learned to measure life in experiments, in minutes, in margins of error. The sky became a laboratory, and the world beneath became a distant map. When the powerful no longer feel the heat of a kitchen fire or the ache of a long road, empathy does not vanish in a dramatic moment. It thins. It becomes abstract. A statistic. Here is the micro-reveal that makes the era darker. Netheril's ascent did not remove suffering. It reorganized it. The comfort and safety granted by magic came unevenly, and the people who benefited most were precisely the people least likely to witness the cost. And yet the Empire truly did achieve wonders. Great engines of enchantment made those cities viable. Artifacts and mythic workings that produced light, stability, warmth, and the constant power needed to keep an impossible civilization alive in the air. For generations, it worked. The enclaves drifted over forests, tundra, and mountain shadow, carrying libraries, laboratories, gardens, and palaces. They were living proofs that Netheril had outgrown the old rules. But every proof has an underside. The same spell work that sustained a flying city also made it dependent in a way ground-bound nations never were. A kingdom can endure drought, invasion, even plague, and still remain a kingdom. A floating city, if its sustaining magic falters, becomes a stone coffin that simply remembers gravity. Around the middle of this chapter, a new kind of rivalry appears, not between nations, but between minds. The most powerful arcanists did not compete for territory the way ordinary rulers do. They competed for breakthroughs, for prestige, for the right to name a new principle of the art. And that kind of competition has no natural endpoint, because every victory makes the next limit feel insulting. Netheril's skyborn splendor taught its leaders a fatal lesson. If you can lift a city, why not lift the laws themselves? By the end of this part, the empire stands at the height of its confidence, its people looking up in awe, its arcanists looking up in hunger, and the world does not yet understand what Netheril has truly built. Not merely cities in the sky, but a civilization balanced on a single invisible foundation that can shatter without warning. The floating enclaves were not just monuments, they were machines. To keep a city aloft and alive, Netheril needed more than spells cast by hand. It needed a constant, regulated source of arcane power, something stable enough to feed wards, engines, weather shields, and the subtle enchantments that held thousands of lives above the earth. That need produced one of Netheril's defining miracles. Mythalars, great reservoirs of arcane force that could sustain enchantments on a scale no other human realm had ever dared. The enclaves became ecosystems of spellwork, with the Mythalar at the heart like a sun trapped in stone. This is where the Empire's greatness becomes frightening. When magic is continuous, it stops feeling like magic. It becomes infrastructure. People stop asking whether it is wise. They begin asking why it is not everywhere. In the streets of these sky cities, daily life could appear almost gentle. Gardens watered without rain, lamps that never dimmed, air warmed in winter, stairways that reshaped themselves, servants made of crafted force. Libraries held centuries of collected spellcraft, and academies trained children to speak the language of the weave before they could fully speak the language of grief. The art was not a craft you visited. It was the air you breathed. But the more Netheril lived inside enchantment, the more its people lost the ability to imagine a world without it. That is the hidden weakness of utopia. It makes the idea of collapse feel impossible, until collapse is the only lesson left. Here is the micro-reveal that changes the tone. Netheril's power was not merely high. It was layered. A single ward depended on another ward, which depended on a binding, which depended on a Mythalar, which depended on principles of the weave that no citizen could see. Their empire was a tower built not from stone, but from assumptions. And assumptions, unlike walls, do not crack slowly. They fail all at once. As decades turned into centuries, a strange moral climate formed in the enclaves. When your society can erase hunger, soften winter, and mend flesh with a gesture, suffering begins to look like a choice made by those who lack knowledge. Compassion becomes something you feel for the unenlightened, the way one might feel pity for a traveler who still walks while others ride. It sounds benevolent. It is not. It is the beginning of contempt. And contempt does not remain private. Netheril's arcanists began to define themselves by what they could do that others could not. They did not merely learn spells. They pursued new strata of spellcasting, what later traditions would call higher circles of magic, working so potent that they reshaped landscapes, minds, and the boundaries of life and death. In Netheril's academies, ambitious students were not told to be careful. They were told to be worthy. Around the middle of this part, the Empire faces a quiet contradiction. The enclaves were proof of mortal triumph, but they were also constant reminders of dependence. Every floating city was a confession. Without the weave, we fall. The more Netheril proclaimed mastery over magic, the more it secretly feared the one thing it could not command: failure. So the arcanists did what power always does when it feels fear. They tried to make the system safer by making it deeper. They pursued stronger bindings, greater reservoirs, more complex enchantments. They widened the gap between what was normal in Netheril and what was possible anywhere else in Faerun. The Empire's marvels became so specific to its own arcane ecosystem that the Netherese began to live in a separate world, even while hovering over the same land. And then a new kind of ambition arrives. Not the ambition to build, but the ambition to surpass the order of reality itself. Because once you can raise cities, once you can sustain them with bottled arcane suns, once you can treat magic as architecture, the next thought is inevitable. If the weave is the foundation, why accept its limits? Why not reach into the structure of magic and remake it to suit the hands that hold it? By the end of this chapter, Netheril stands at its most dazzling, a civilization of drifting stone and endless spell light. Yet beneath the radiance is a truth that cannot be warded away. The brighter the enchantment, the darker the shadow it casts, and Netheril's shadow is beginning to stretch across the gods themselves. In Netheril, greatness was never left to chance. It was engineered, then competed over. The enclaves drifted like separate heavens, and each became the reflection of a single will, an arch-wizard's taste, discipline, pride, and cruelty. Netheril was an empire in name, but in practice it was a constellation of arcane city-states, bound together less by loyalty than by shared dependence on the same invisible foundation. The art unified them, ambition divided them. A lesser realm measures rivalry in borders and armies. Netheril measured it in spellcraft. To outshine a rival enclave was to publish a new working, to unveil a mythalar refinement, to craft defenses no other mind could unravel. Prestige had weight. It decided who received apprentices, who gained access to guarded lore, who was invited into the inner circles where the rules of magic were treated like problems to be solved rather than truths to be respected. Here is the first reveal that darkens the Golden Age. Netheril's most brilliant minds did not merely pursue power for comfort. They pursued power to avoid humiliation. And that motive, when dressed in scholarship, becomes a furnace that never cools. In those centuries, arcanists pushed upward through the highest circles of spellcasting, creating magics that later ages would only speak of with fear. They treated the weave like a structure made for renovation, something that could be reshaped, optimized, made more efficient, more obedient. And because their successes were real, the caution of priests and the warnings of old traditions began to sound like jealousy. Around the middle of this chapter, the Empire's confidence collides with a threat it cannot simply impress into silence. The Faerun, ancient and alien, moving beneath the world like hunger given thought. Their war with Netheril was not fought in open fields. It was fought in the deep places, through curses, counterspells, draining magics, and slow ecological ruin. The land itself began to change under the pressure, as if the world were being leached. Netheril's splendor did not float above a peaceful realm. It floated above a battlefield that most common folk could not even name. That hidden war sharpened Netheril's worst instincts. When enemies do not march where you can see them, you stop caring about ordinary limits. The arcanists responded with heavier magic, broader wards, more aggressive experiments. They did not ask what their countermeasures would do to the future. They asked only whether the future would exist without them. And still, rivalry continued, because even crisis becomes a stage in a culture addicted to ranking itself. One archwizard proposed an answer, another dismissed it. A third offered something more elegant and more terrible. Netheril's genius became a spiral, solutions demanding greater power demanding deeper dependence demanding still harsher solutions. By the end of this part, the Empire stands revealed in a harsher light. Netheril's pride was not merely vanity, it was policy. Its greatest achievements were not simply wonders. They were necessities built to survive threats that forced the arcanists to reach beyond restraint. The world remembers the floating cities as symbols of triumph, but the truth is heavier. They were also fortresses, proof that Netheril was already living as if ordinary reality could no longer be trusted to hold. Netheril's greatest mistake was not that it loved magic. It was that it forgot magic was not merely a discipline. It was a living order. In the enclaves, the art had become so constant that most Netherese stopped thinking of it as something granted or permitted. They spoke of spellcraft the way other nations spoke of iron or grain, resources to be refined, stockpiled, and spent. When a mythaler fed a city's wards night after night, it taught a silent lesson. Power is stable. Power is owned. The weave became, in the Netherese imagination, a kind of architecture, but the weave was never a building. It was a bond. The goddess of magic, Mistral in that age, was not a distant symbol placed above spellcasters like a crown over a king. She was tied to the very structure that made mortal spellcasting possible. Netheril's arcanists could ignore temples, mock priests, and treat worship as an old habit of groundfolk, but they could not escape the deeper truth. Every spell, from the smallest light to the grandest working that held a city in the sky, still passed through a divine order that did not belong to them. Here is the micro-reveal that reframes Netheril's freedom. The Empire's miracles were never independent. Even the wonders that looked self-sustaining were ultimately borrowing from something alive, something governed by cosmic law rather than mortal preference. And once that truth is pushed aside, the next step is almost inevitable. Netheril began to treat limits as a kind of insult. The highest arcanists spoke of spell levels the way climbers speak of peaks, and in the late Empire they reached heights no later age would touch again. They were not content to cast within known boundaries. They designed new circles of power, 10th, 11th, even 12th, workings so extreme that they did not merely change the world, they challenged the premise that gods alone defined the ceiling of mortal magic. Around the middle of this chapter, the Empire's inner philosophy becomes clear. Netheril did not see itself as sinful, it saw itself as destined. If mortals could raise cities, if they could defeat threats that ancient kingdoms could not name, then why should they accept any divine boundary that felt arbitrary? In that mindset, a ban is not a warning, it is a puzzle. This is where names like Iulam and Karsus begin to matter, not as legends, but as symptoms of an age. Iulam represented the vast, patient intellect of Netheril, a mind that treated the art as a sea to be mapped. Karsus represented something sharper, a prodigy's certainty that the map was not enough, that the sea itself should be seized and commanded. And here is the anchor that changes how the listener understands Netheril's confidence. The Empire's greatest works were not built on magic the way a palace is built on stone. They were built through magic the way a ship is built through water. Remove the water, and the ship does not stand. It simply stops being a ship. Netheril was, in the strictest sense, suspended inside the weave. That was its glory. That was its vulnerability. By the end of this part, the fall no longer feels like an accident waiting in the future. It feels like a moral and structural certainty already present in the present. Because when a civilization mistakes a living covenant for a tool and begins to rewrite the laws that make its own wonders possible, it is not only courting disaster, it is placing its entire weight on the one thing it has decided to stop respecting. Karsus did not rise in Netheril because he was merely talented. Talent was common there, like stone and wind. He rose because he carried a conviction that frightened even other archwizards, the belief that the gods were not the ceiling of magic, only the current occupants of it. He studied the highest circles of Netherese spellcraft, the way others studied anatomy, learning where the art could be cut, where it could be stitched, where it could be forced to do what it was never meant to do. And in the late Empire, when Netheril's power was already so immense it felt self-justifying, that kind of mind found an audience. Fear of collapse, fear of rivals, fear of enemies beneath the land. All of it whispered the same temptation: take control of the source. Here is the first quiet reveal. Karsus's plan was not born only from arrogance. It was also born from dependence. Netheril had built wonders that could not survive a single true failure of the weave, and the Empire's greatest arcanists knew it. When your entire civilization is balanced on an invisible law, the impulse to seize that law starts to feel like responsibility. So Karsus reached for an impossible solution. A 12th circle working remembered as Karsus's avatar, a spell designed to steal the divinity of a god and wear it like a mantle. Not to borrow power, to replace the hand on the lever. It is difficult to grasp what that means without shrinking it into metaphor. This was not a duel. This was not heresy in a temple. This was a mortal attempting to take the governing force of magic itself and redirect it through a human mind. The anchor comes in a single, catastrophic moment. Karsus cast the spell and targeted Mistril, the goddess of magic in that age, the one bound to the weave's very operation. For a heartbeat that history can barely describe, the transfer occurred. Divinity flooded into him. The weave shuddered as if the world had inhaled and forgotten how to exhale. And then the cost arrived. Maestril's nature was not a throne that could be occupied by any clever claimant. It was a cosmic function, a living balance. Karsus, for all his brilliance, was still mortal, finite, breathing, bounded by thought and flesh. He could not contain the godhood he seized, and he could not understand, in that instant, the infinite complexity he had grabbed by the throat. Magic began to fail. Not gradually, not with warning. It failed like a severed nerve. Across Netheril, spells unraveled mid-casting. Enchantments sputtered. Wards that had stood for generations went dead. Mythilars, those captive sons sustaining the enclaves, lost the stable flow they required. The sky cities did not fall because someone attacked them. They fell because the principle that held them up suddenly stopped obeying. Maestril's response was sacrifice. To prevent the weave from collapsing into total annihilation, she gave up her own existence, severing the spell's theft and breaking the chain before reality could tear further. It saved the world. It killed Netheril. Karsus died with his victory still burning in him, a brief god whose mind could not hold what it had stolen. And in the wake of his failure, a new order was forced upon magic itself. The highest Netherese circles became a forbidden height, not by decree of kings, but because the cosmos had shown what happens when mortals reach for the foundation instead of building upon it. Netheril had wanted certainty, control over the source. What it proved instead was this: magic is not merely power to be taken. It is structure. And when you try to seize the structure, you do not become its master. You become the point where it breaks. When Mistril tore herself out of existence to stop the weave from collapsing entirely, the world did not feel a clean salvation. It felt a wound being cauterized with fire. In that instant, spellcasting across Faerun did not simply weaken, it convulsed. The art that Netheril treated as architecture became sudden absence, like a stairway turning into open air under a man's foot. Wizards found their prepared workings slipping away like water through fingers. Enchantments that had been permanent proved they were only patient. Even the simplest spells could fail, not from lack of skill, but because the underlying order had gone silent. And in Netheril, silence was death. The floating enclaves were not held aloft by courage or stone. They were held aloft by continuity. Their mythilars were engines that needed a stable relationship with the weave to sustain the impossible. When that relationship shattered, The sky cities became what they had always secretly been. Tremendous, heavy things that had forgotten gravity was real. Here is the first reveal that changes how the fall is understood. Netheril did not collapse like a kingdom. It collapsed like a system. One principle failed, and 1,000 marvels failed with it, each dependent on the last. Some enclaves died immediately. Others lingered for minutes or hours as their sustaining magic sputtered, buying time only long enough for terror to become complete. People ran through streets that had never known panic, looking for doors that would open, for teleport circles that would answer, for a spell that would behave like it had behaved yesterday. Many found nothing but dead sigils and cold stone. Around the middle of this chapter, the catastrophe reaches its anchor, not in the sky, but in the descent. Cities fell, not as ruins gently drifting down, but as mountains dropped from the heavens. Towers shattered like pottery. Great halls became dust and splinters. Entire populations were erased in impacts so vast that the ground itself became a witness, marked forever by craters, broken valleys, and fields of stone turned to powder. The Netherils had built their pride into the air. The earth answered with a single verdict. Yet even in total disaster, the world's cruelty is uneven. Some Netherils were not in the enclaves when the sky turned traitor. Some were on the ground in settlements, watching the wonders above them begin to fall like dying stars. And some, few, had contingencies that did not rely on the broken rules of that moment. Refugees, shelters, older protections, the kind of preparation that only the most paranoid archwizards ever bothered to fund. Survival was not a reward for goodness. It was a reward for distance, luck, and foresight. Then the land itself began to change. Netheril's final centuries had already strained the region with great magics and hidden wars, and the fall poured the last weight onto a world that could not bear it. What had been living territories became scarred and drying. In time, the heartland that once fed an empire would be remembered as Anauroch, a vast desert born from ruin, where the wind carries sand through places that once held libraries and gardens. And after the screams, after the impacts, after the long day when the sky stopped being trustworthy, a quieter transformation settled over all spellcasters who lived through it. Magic returned, but it returned altered. Mistral was gone. A new goddess of magic would arise, and with her came a hard boundary written into the nature of spellcasting itself, an unspoken scar that prevented mortals from climbing to the same lethal heights again. Netheril had proved that the upper reaches of magic were not merely dangerous. They were destabilizing to reality. So the world continued. People still cast spells. Empires still rose. But the art carried a new, invisible history within it, a limit born from a sacrifice and a fall. And the truth left behind was heavy and clean. Netheril was not destroyed by an enemy that outmatched it, but by a single act that broke the relationship between ambition and the living order that made ambition possible. The world that followed the fall did not feel like a new era. It felt like an aftermath that refused to end. In the region that would be called Anauroch, the ruins of Netheril did not sit as orderly monuments. They lay scattered like bones across a widening wound, broken stone half buried, shattered spires jutting from dunes, vaults sealed by ancient wards that still clung to life like dying embers. Travelers who crossed those sands later spoke of strange lights at night, of the sensation that the air itself remembered spells that were no longer permitted to exist. Here is the first reveal of the post-fall truth. Netheril did not vanish. It fragmented. And fragments can be more dangerous than a whole empire, because they persist without the restraint of civilization. The survivors on the ground inherited a nightmare of responsibility. They lived beneath the shadow of a catastrophe they did not cause, surrounded by relics that could burn a mind or summon horrors with a single misstep. Many tried to bury Netheril's remains. Others tried to plunder them. Both approaches failed because Netheril's legacy was not only material, it was intellectual. The idea of what the art could do had already been released into the world, and no desert could swallow that. Around the middle of this chapter, a darker consequence becomes clear. The fall did not only destroy cities, it destabilized the balance of power across the north. Realms that had lived in Netheril's shadow suddenly faced a vacuum. Smaller powers scrambled, old alliances collapsed, and in the wasteland, things that had been kept down by Netherese dominance began to move. Some were mortals, wizards, treasure hunters, cults, drawn like moths to the scent of lost power. Others were older than mortal kingdoms, drawn by the weakening and reshaping of the land. When an empire collapses through a magical cataclysm, it does not simply leave ruins. It leaves conditions, arcane scars that attract predators. And then there were the enclaves themselves, not all of them resting where they fell. The common telling imagines every sky city smashed into rubble. Many did. Yet Netheril's history is cruelly asymmetrical. Some enclaves were positioned, protected, or altered in ways that allowed them to persist in distorted form. Caverns were filled with shattered districts. Deep vaults became sealed tombs of spellcraft. Whole sections of city life, preserved in silence, waited in darkness for centuries, as if time itself had been trapped by the last breaths of enchantment. That is the emotional hook of the aftermath. The lost empire did not merely die. It lingered, sometimes as wreckage, sometimes as haunted survivals, sometimes as temptations that could still speak to the living. And in the wider world, the lesson of Netheril began to harden into taboo. Wizards of later ages inherited rules they did not fully understand, not as a gentle tradition, but as a wall built into the nature of magic itself. The highest circles that Netheril had reached became unreachable, not because people stopped wanting them, but because the weave would not allow them. The art itself had learned fear. By the end of this chapter, the fall has become something more than a historical disaster. It has become a landscape, physical and spiritual. Anauroch is not just a desert, it is a warning written in sand. Netheril is not just a dead realm, it is a memory embedded in the rules of spellcasting, and the world that walks forward does so with an invisible weight on its back. The knowledge that the greatest empire of magic did not fall to an army, but to a single moment when the structure of the art refused to be owned. The fall should have ended the story. It did not. It only ended the empire. In the centuries that followed, Netheril survived the way a wildfire survives, never as a single blaze, but as embers hidden under ash, waiting for wind. Most of those embers were not cities. They were ideas, techniques copied into lesser grimoires, half-understood principles passed from master to apprentice in whispers. The memory of what high magic had once achieved, and the quiet resentment that the world itself now refused to allow it again. Because magic returned, but it returned with a scar. The weave endured under a new goddess of magic, and with that renewal came limits that were no longer merely cultural. They were structural. Netheril's highest circles, those terrible heights where mortals tried to seize the foundations, became unreachable, not forbidden by a king, denied by reality. And that denial reshaped wizardry across Faerun more than any war could have. ambition remained. But it now pressed against an invisible ceiling built from the memory of catastrophe. Here is the micro-reveal that reframes the lesson of Netheril. The world did not become safer because people grew wiser. It became safer because the rules changed. Mortals were not trusted to restrain themselves. The art restrained them. Yet restraint does not erase longing. It only concentrates it. Across the wastes of Anauroch and beyond, seekers returned again and again to Nether's ruins. Some came for relics. Some came for spells that had slipped out of history. Some came for proof, because if Netheril had truly reached so high, then surely there must be a way to climb again. Many died. Others returned with fragments, a surviving ward, a cracked mythalar component, a spell diagram that made later arcanists stare in equal parts, awe and dread. Around the middle of this chapter, one survival stands apart, because it was not an accident. It was a choice made in advance, a kind of escape that turned defeat into preservation. One enclave did not fall into Anauroch, it fled into shadow. In the moment the weave convulsed and the sky cities began to die, the enclave of shade, Thultanthar, was drawn away from the catastrophe by means that did not rely on the same failing structure. It passed into a darker reflection of the world, carrying its people, its pride, and its culture intact in a place where sunlight was memory and mercy was thin. There, Netheril did not become a ruin. It became an exile. And exile does something strange to a civilization. It does not soften it. It concentrates it. Cut off from the world that had witnessed their downfall, the Netherese of shade carried their identity like a blade. They did not need to pretend the fall was a warning. They could treat it as an injustice, proof that the gods feared mortal greatness, proof that the world had been stolen from those most fit to rule it. In shadow, the Empire's old doctrine, magic as birthright, supremacy as destiny, could survive without the moderating pressure of neighbors, trade, or ordinary human need. This is the heavier truth of Netheril's aftermath. Ruins teach humility, but survival can preserve arrogance. By the end of this part, the fall looks less like a clean ending and more like a turning of the page. Netheril's towers shattered, its mythalars failed, its skies betrayed it. Yet the legacy that mattered most did not lie buried under sand. It lived on in the rules etched into magic itself, and in the few who endured long enough to remember not only what Netheril was, but what it believed it deserved. Netheril is remembered as a calamity. It should also be remembered as a definition, because after the fall, Faerûn did not merely inherit ruins. It inherited a boundary, one that shaped every spell cast afterward, whether the caster knew Netheril's name or not. The world still produced archmages, still birthed empires, still tempted the brilliant and the desperate with the promise that the art can rewrite fate. But the weave itself carried a memory. It had been grabbed once. It would not be grabbed again. This is the first, final reveal. The greatest legacy of Netheril is not Anauroch, not shattered enclaves, not even the mythalars. It is the idea that magic is governed, not simply by skill, but by structure, by stewardship, and by consequences that reach beyond the intentions of any mortal mind. In the ages that followed, wizards built schools and traditions that treated caution as wisdom, yet even that caution often rested on a misunderstanding. Many later spellcasters believed Netheril fell because its mages were too proud. Pride was part of it. But Netheril's true failure was more precise. It was the decision to treat the weave as property rather than relationship, to treat divinity as a resource to be seized rather than a cosmic function that cannot be worn like a crown. That is why the fall feels so clean in hindsight. The Empire's final act did not merely anger gods. It destabilized the operating principle of magic itself. When Karsus targeted Mistral, he struck the point where spellcasting, civilization, and divine order were interlocked. For a moment, the world slipped. Then Mistral broke the chain with her own life. Netheril died so the world could remain castable at all. Around the middle of this final chapter, the warning takes its truest form. Netheril did not prove that mortals must never reach high. It proved that there are kinds of reaching that tear the ladder from reality. That warning is why later ages speak of mysteries surrounding Netheril with such reverence. Not because the truth is hidden, but because the truth is heavy. A floating city is a beautiful image until you remember it is also a mass of stone depending on an invisible law. An archwizard's brilliance is admirable until you remember brilliance does not expand the capacity of a human mind to hold infinity without breaking. Even Netheril's surviving embers, ruins in a Narok, secrets in sealed vaults, the long exile of shade, do not contradict the lesson. They sharpen it. They show that power can outlive wisdom. They show that consequences can be delayed, but not denied. They show that when magic becomes the measure of worth, compassion becomes optional, and the world begins to feel like raw material. So the story ends where it began, not in the sky, but in a choice. Netheril chose to build a civilization inside magic rather than alongside it. That choice produced wonders no human realm had ever seen. It also made the Empire unable to survive the one thing no spell can permanently banish: failure. When the Foundation shuddered, Netheril did not simply lose a battle. It lost the right to remain coherent. And that is why the fall of Netheril still matters, even to those who will never walk a Narok's sands. It is the clearest proof the realms ever offered that the art is not a torch to be seized by the strongest hand. It is a living order that holds the world together until someone tries to hold it instead.